Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Today we'll be talking about the Stormtrooper Corps, one of the most famous organizations in the wider Star Wars franchise, and also one of the more confusing and controversial aspects of the lore. Because on paper, the Stormtrooper Corps is supposed to be elite, yet in practice, especially in the films, they seem to miss every shot they take. They're extremely clumsy in their armor as well, and they utilize very crude tactics. Nothing about them seems elite at all. But then, we have one-liners like this.
And these last points, too accurate for sand people. Only Imperial Stormtroopers are so precise.
And we can trust old Ben's assessment on this. Almost a decade earlier, he had to fight a bunch of Stormtroopers when he rescued Leia from that underwater Inquisitor's base. Even if he was a little out of practice with the Force, the Stormtroopers of 9 BBY in the Kenobi series were quite formidable, especially compared to the Stormtroopers of 0 BBY in A New Hope. And yes, there is a difference. And understanding what happened to them is kind of easy, especially now because the recent Andor series does such a good job at explaining everything. Andor, which runs from 5 BBY to 0 BBY, is designed to give us a sense of time and help us understand how quickly a galaxy can go from being relatively stable to open civil war. In the first arc of Andor, we don't start off in the heart of Imperial territory. Instead, we start off in corporate space, and the enforcers of this territory come in the form of corporate security. And so our hero in this story doesn't start off fighting Stormtroopers like Luke does in A New Hope. Instead, he's fighting tactical blueberries.
Corporate tactical forces are the Empire's first line of defense, and the best way to keep the blade sharp is to use it.
You know, we can make jokes about these guys. We can make fun of how a lot of them are kind of like wider than they are tall. But having a self-governing corporate sector was really a win-win for the Empire. Definitely not a win-win for the people living in those corporate sectors, but by allowing the consolidated holdings of Preax Morlana Corporation control the free trade sector, the Empire basically got to collect tax revenue from Preax Morlana without really spending any money on services or security. The corporates took care of all of that, providing a very localized security force well suited for the challenges in the region. Or at least that's what I'm sure the Preax Morlana execs told the Empire, because they were lying this whole time. I wouldn't be surprised if these guys were cutting corners and armored plating everywhere they could. There's definitely a tendency for some individuals like Chief Hines to hide the real crime rates in order to avoid scrutiny from his own bosses and the Empire. Zealous enforcers like Cyril, who really want to push the boundaries of what Preax Morlana is supposed to do, represents the other side of this equation. You know, when individuals like Chief Hines and Cyril work together, if there is a compromise from both sides, then good things can actually happen. Cyril can learn from Chief Hines' experience and wisdom, and Chief Hines can borrow some of Cyril's passion and youthful energy. But of course, that's not what happens. Chief Hines leaves, Cyril is placed in charge for a few days, and there is no check on his power, and so Cyril crosses all the lines. Now, Cyril makes the right assessment with the information available to him. There's a murder of a Preax Morlana employee, and if I were in a situation, I'd probably be outraged as well. Remember, he doesn't know that these two security guards that Cassian murdered were harassing him and were just all around dipshits. But regardless of what they did for there to be a functioning society, you just can't have people getting away with killing people. At a minimum, we're looking at involuntary manslaughter and a second-degree murder, or something. The fact that Chief Hines was trying to cover up this incident shows us just how bad the situation had gotten over the years, which also shows you the problem with privatizing what really should be a public responsibility with a lot of transparency and checks and balances. Law enforcement is a very difficult job. It's not easy to do, but we definitely cannot allow these people to self-regulate themselves. That is just a recipe for disaster. The mission to fund Cassian had to happen. The only problem is years of neglect by Chief Hines and other leaders like him meant that there was really no security presence on Ferrix at all. There's no existing lawmen, no police station, no security monitoring network. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, these tactical blueberries look more like an away team journeying to a new planet, making scientific discoveries than a local policing force. With no sitrep, no assets on the ground, no understanding of the local area, are we surprised that this small little tactical team almost got swallowed up on Ferrix? Heck, these guys are lucky that there's only one wild Brasso roaming around in the streets. Cyril is far too inexperienced, Sergeant Linus Musk is far too eager to experience action, and the result is a disaster happens, and that attracts the attention of the ISB. Chief Hines, the facade manager, the cover-your-ass commander, he's a tired old man. He's unfortunately learned that in his line of work, one fails upward by never sticking your neck out and rocking the boat. He's the type of person who survives the longest in these types of systems. He looks around and he sees that no one's following any of the rules or orders, and so he's not going to enforce anything that will, get him into trouble. He's just laying low. Chief Hines is just another part of this facade, and so there was really just this illusion of security and stability in the free trade sector. The threat of the Pax Morlana tactical enforcement forces was just great enough that large-scale criminal operations weren't present, but just about every little petty crime or, exploitation racket that you could think of was going on in this sector, oftentimes being perpetuated by the people who were in charge of the security, which oftentimes happen when you have a corrupt system.
They're in a brothel, which we're not supposed to have, the expensive one, which they shouldn't be able to afford, drinking Rivnold, which we're not supposed to allow. Both of them supposedly on the job, which is a dismissible offense.
The area was probably terrible to live in. Constant crime and corruption tends to drain economic activity, but it was a low-level kind of suck. A more mundane type of tyranny that knows to keep itself hidden within the layers of complicated systems designed to control society. This type of tyranny presents a very elusive target that is very hard for its detractors to find and actually attack. It's a very smart type of tyranny, the banality of evil that we always talk about. And this is ultimately far more sustainable than what happens when the ISB decides to take over the operation with its bull and china shop-like sensitivity to the locals' wishes. You see, the Pax Morlana security forces faced an uphill battle. They had too much territory, they had too many sparsely populated areas, and just not enough resources or manpower to really do anything about it all. And so the corporals decided to take a minimalistic, non-invasive route to enforcement and hope for the best. The ISB bring in a considerably larger amount of resources, but let's be honest, it's still a drop in the bucket, especially when they kick up the hornet's nest. One squad of tactical blueberries versus a city isn't all that different from one company of Imperial troopers versus a city. They're still going to be completely outnumbered, and in my opinion, if you are going to try to enforce laws, you should have the right tools to do so. If you don't have the right tools, you're just asking for trouble. This was the problem that every government in galactic history faced, and there was really no solution to the problem. In the core regions, you had enough people and economic activity to afford a robust security force, but the closer you get to the peripherals, that economic and social equation just completely falls apart. Either the core regions subsidized the security of the Outer Rim, or everything just fell apart, and that's just usually what happened. The Imperial Army is actually the largest infantry force in the Galactic Empire by far. We tend to see the Stormtrooper Corps more because the Star Wars saga mostly takes place much later on in galactic history, around 0 BBY. But in 5 BBY, most military installations, most planetary garrisons are being guarded and watched by Imperial Army troopers. These troopers were mostly recruited from planetary or local defense forces that existed during the Clone Wars period. The previous conflict had shaken the entire galaxy, and Palpatine was able to easily consolidate power and military leadership underneath his executive branch during this period. With all the galaxy's local defense forces rolled into one and standardized, the Imperial Army became the largest military force the galaxy had ever seen. Now, obviously, the quality and standard of training of these soldiers were pretty relaxed and varied from unit to unit. More importantly, there was no real attempt to properly indoctrinate these troopers into Imperial ideology. Many of these troopers are also deployed pretty close to their homeworld, which only made their jobs easier, which is a good thing. Overall, the Imperial Army was a cost-effective way to create a large security presence very quickly at the end of the Clone Wars. By standardizing everything, you're decreasing the cost of arming these groups, which is great. You're also having locals patrol their own areas so they might better understand what's going on in these territories, and they might have a better connection culturally to the people they're actually patrolling, which are all good things. But unfortunately, that's not what Palpatine wants. He doesn't want good things. He wants ruthless enforcers who are willing to do whatever he wants them to do. And during the Aldhani heist, we kind of see the problem with these Imperial Army units. They're pretty relaxed when it comes to decorum and procedure. I mean, troopers commonly fraternize with each other and even the locals, which is just kind of unheard of in the Stormtrooper Corps. I mean, by the last year of the Galactic Civil War, Stormtroopers couldn't even remove their helmets or have any idle chatter with one another on a mission because their comms were being monitored constantly by the ISB. Unfortunately for the Imperial Army, when the Axis Network raided the Aldhani garrison, it became very clear that the Imperial Army would be used as a scapegoat. Their lack of discipline and indoctrination led to Second-in-Command Lieutenant Gorn defecting to the rebellion and aiding them in their operation. It was also reported that Lieutenant Gorn had developed a relationship with one of the local women, which of course led to him developing some sympathy for the plight of the local Aldani people, especially after she was killed by Imperial forces. I mean, that was the real problem with Lieutenant Gorn, because he was legitimately doing his job, which was to protect the local people, the Aldani, whereas what Palpatine really wanted the Imperial Army to do was to protect his interests, right? It's two completely different organizations. And so the Aldani heist was really the beginning of the end for the Imperial Army trooper. Palpatine wanted them out immediately, and he wanted to increase the size of the Stormtrooper Corps and have them as their replacement, in the same way that he wanted the ISB to basically take over all of the other security apparatuses and intelligence gathering agencies that existed as well. Palpatine no longer wanted independent and thinking soldiers and enforcers. He wanted an indoctrinated machine, very similar to the Separatist droid army or clone army that he could just personally control and destroy his enemies with. Here's the thing though, from the very beginning, the Stormtrooper Corps was an elite unit. Realistically, only a small percentage of the larger population could even hope to become one because of the very strict requirements for recruitment. There were physical requirements like height.
Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?
Huh? There's also weight requirements, strength requirements, your physical abilities, and more importantly, they were looking for people with a certain mindset. You know, extremely loyal and obedient individuals who were also intelligent enough to be effective in combat. They also wanted emotionally stable individuals who would break under stress and, most importantly, put the mission before themselves and their fellow troopers. In the beginning, the first batches of stormtroopers were recruited out of the Imperial Academy system and then sent to stormtrooper training, where they participated in specialized curriculum that involved tons of PT, arms and combat training, but also daily indoctrination designed to make these soldiers loyal not only to the state, but to Palpatine directly. You can view the Stormtrooper Corps almost like, you know, an honor guard or a special presidential guard, I guess. Which means by its very nature, the Stormtrooper Corps should be limited in numbers. And if we take a look at the early seasons of Andor or other, shows and movies that take place in the early Imperial era, all you really do see everywhere is Imperial Army troopers. You see a lot less stormtroopers. On the horrific battle world of Minbom, it's mostly Imperial Army troopers holding the trench lines against the Minbonese. But you also see individual stormtroopers sprinkled in the midst to provide a boost in morale and capabilities. Now, during the Ferrex Rite, we see a similar setup. On the ground level, we have Imperial Army security troopers deployed to stop the riots, and then up top, we have stormtroopers armed with E11s should things go sideways. And then we have finally the Gorman Massacre, the second one. It's almost like a symbolic changing of the guards between the stormtroopers and the Imperial Army troopers. Once again, we see the Imperial Army security troopers that are especially trained to handle riots in the first ranks of the Imperial forces on Palmo. They are backed by stormtroopers, and we also see other stormtrooper units kind of cordon everyone into the center of the square where they're going to get massacred. But what do they do in the middle of the riots? What does the ISB do? They send in a platoon of Imperial Army troopers to clear a pathway through the crowd. They're sacrificial lambs of sorts, and their death will awaken true chaos and destruction. I'm almost certain this isn't the first time that the Empire has deliberately ordered their own agents to open fire on their own soldiers. But yeah, this to me is really the symbolic death of the Imperial Army Trooper program. They literally sacrifice these individuals because they don't really trust them to do their jobs. They don't trust them to be as hardened as the stormtroopers. After Aldani, after Gorman, that's when we really see a decline in Imperial Army trooper numbers. They would start disappearing the same way that the clone troopers failed and disappeared, just like I'm sure the short-lived TK trooper program was upgraded after it too failed and disappeared. The real problem here is Palpatine is arrogant, right? He's trying to tackle this very complicated problem that has existed for thousands of years. This is a problem that involves economic, cultural, and social factors. Yet Palpatine is just trying to use the military to fix everything. And obviously it's not going to work. People before him have tried this, and they've also failed. It doesn't matter how loyal Palpatine's soldiers were. Brute force wasn't going to pacify the Outer Rim, no matter how many stormtroopers he trained. And by the end of the Galactic Civil War, he trained a lot of them. We already saw an increased presence of bucketheads on worlds like Lothal earlier than other areas of the galaxy. That was mainly because Lothal was home to the Phoenix Cell, one of the early thorns in the Empire's side. Lothal was an important resource extraction and manufacturing world, and it was very important to cleanse the planet of such problems. But even back then, the problems with the Stormtrooper Corps were apparent already. The lack of communication between these troopers meant poor cohesion at the unit level. The lack of individualism and autonomy meant that only officers were given the permission to think for themselves, which meant that you had very little initiative from the rank and file enlisted men and non-coms, something that is almost required when it comes to counterinsurgency missions. These insurgents operate in small and hidden groups. Oftentimes they're made up of the local civilian populace. What you needed were more empathetic individuals that understood the local population, that had better intelligence gathering capabilities, and weren't just essentially stormtroopers, But of course, Palpatine didn't want troopers that could empathize with the local populace or understand the local populace, because he also understood that if soldiers actually really thought about what the Empire was doing in a lot of these worlds, they'd probably realize that they're the baddies. The Stormtrooper Corps was also a pretty small unit, comparable to the United States Marine Corps and how it's structured, but probably even smaller in actual size. It was officially a part of the Imperial Army, although with its own chain of command that led directly to Darth Vader and Palpatine. The Stormtrooper Corps was really just an expeditionary light infantry force that depended on Imperial Army vehicle support and Imperial Navy transportation and firepower. Stormtrooper units were generally deployed at the Legion level on Imperial-class Star Destroyers as ship security and also as invasion forces if needed. On smaller ships, you also had smaller-sized Stormtrooper units, and then at high-security bases like Scarif, you also ran into formations of these Stormtroopers. Now, Stormtroopers had their own officers, they had their own drivers, some support staff, but every Stormtrooper, first and foremost, was an infantry soldier. This is what they were known for. There was very much a culture of wanting to run towards the fight. If you take a look at Stormtrooper tactics, they almost always are moving against their enemies in a very direct and visible line. There's no flanking maneuver, no tricks or concealment or taking cover, and it's intimidating to see just waves upon waves of these plastoid-covered troopers running at you, ignoring their fallen comrades and the incoming fire. It makes Stormtroopers excellent at storming heavily defended positions or partaking in boarding actions. The indoctrination and training play a big role in this. And this kind of made sense when the Empire had complete control over the galaxy and just basically endless amount of people to throw at whatever problems they were facing, right? You didn't have to really preserve the lives of your individual troopers, but of course that became a bigger and bigger problem as the Galactic Civil War started heating up. When the Stormtrooper Corps started taking over the duties of the Imperial Army, the quality of their training and indoctrination took a huge hit. The Stormtrooper School just couldn't accommodate the massive number of recruits that were being brought in. And so a new training facility, which was basically just basic training, took over. And this is how you get all of these new Stormtrooper units that are just made up of, subpar soldiers. Also, by this point, the original clones who had stayed on and formed the core of many of these units had either been killed in, big battles like the Death Star blowing up, or just simply have been phased out, further decreasing the combat effectiveness of these groups. From what it looks like to me, the reason why so many Stormtroopers are so clumsy in their armor is because they are literally Imperial Army troopers with that new armor and new helmet that they're not used to. This might even be why so many Stormtroopers struggle to hit their targets with their blasters. It just could be because they're Imperial Army troopers who aren't used to firing weapons with a full-face helmet. I imagine there's a special type of training that goes with this. Now, despite the fact that the Stormtrooper Corps increased in size and decreased in quality, at the very end of the war, some of the most intense holdouts were still Stormtrooper units. They refused to give up. So I guess the indoctrination did work to a certain extent, even if the combat abilities didn't translate very well into these new versions of the Stormtroopers. But I think this is a very realistic portrayal of what happens when you have a crazy dictator in charge who really is just trying to create a military force to serve himself, right? Every iteration of the Imperial Army gets worse and worse, more chaotic, less effective, because Palpatine just wants to control everything. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.